Good morning, everybody. Just a quick sound check. Can everybody hear and see as well? I see a couple of people have found the chat already. Maybe one or two of you can sort of let us know whether the sound is okay. That's a couple of yeses, so we're good to go. Again, welcome to this webinar on driving growth with innovation. It's the third in a series of four in which we address several key innovation topics. Today, we will talk about how to organize innovation within your company. In the last webinar in this series, we will cover, by the way, how to build innovation skills and competencies and an innovation culture. At the end of the webinar, you can sign up for the next webinar.
And welcome from me as well. We do these webinars regularly. Last year, we talked about the 3 innovation challenges. So first of all, we talked about the ideation challenge, or how to spot and select the right innovations for your organization. Then we moved on to the validation challenge, where we talked about how to assess the true potential of your new ideas, but also avoid unjustified investments in hobby horses or innovations that just don't work for you. And then in our third webinar of last year, we talked about the scale-up challenge, which in our opinion is one of the most difficult stages in your innovation journey, where you turn on the growth engines on your innovations and basically build a sustainable business out of them. We do these webinars just to talk about best-in-class innovators and share best practices. And what we found is that if we look at best-in-class innovators, is that they have a couple of characteristics, right? So the first one is that they have a well-defined innovation strategy and roadmap, which is something we talked about in January.
Yeah, right.
The other one is the next one is that they manage their innovation portfolio professionally, which was the topic of our last webinar in February. And today we'll talk about how to embed innovation in your organization as a third topic. And the fourth characteristic of best-in-class innovators is that they continuously develop their innovation competence, culture, and leadership, which then obviously is the topic of our webinar coming up in April. And just because it's a nice segue from the last webinar into this one, just to briefly recap what we did on portfolio management. We introduced our framework for portfolio management. So how do you sort of effectively manage your innovation projects through those 6 stages of innovation? That was effectively, we talked about what of innovation, and today we'll focus a bit more on the how of innovation when we talk about organization, as well as next time when we talk about leadership. Just to point out, the portfolio management webinar you can listen to or look at on our website, and there actually all of our webinars are available there.
Right. Well, just as a brief introduction, my name is Mark Douwme. I'm partner and co-founder at RevelX. Next to me sits Matthijs Rosman. As always, I would always say, we will be hosting your webinar today. And as always, we have Rob Nouwens, not on screen, but important role. He's behind the controls. I think you've been emailing with him back and forth on the invitations. And Rob's going to make sure that everything runs smoothly. He will also pick up questions from the chat. Just briefly about RevelX, we're a boutique consultancy firm. We help clients to realize growth through innovation. We work for large corporates as well as smaller scale-ups that aim to grow fast and to become a large corporate, and we do so in a wide range of industries. By the way, we have quite an international hearing today. We have people from Zagreb, I see. We have people from Spain. Texel, which is well almost like abroad.
Good morning.
Good morning again, everybody, to you. Looking at today's webinar, we'll be covering 4 key topics. First, we will go into the question of why is the organization of innovation so important. Secondly, it's kind of a dilemma we often face when discussing this with our clients is, well, to centralize or not to centralize. And you could say that's the question.
Yeah.
And we'll be giving you some arguments to do so, or maybe to decentralize. The main part will then focus around the building blocks of what we call the building blocks for your innovation organization. And then lastly, we'll sort of highlight one of those building blocks, which is the growth board, and their role in managing your innovation efforts, also linking it back again to the portfolio management webinar of last time. Well, some of you have already participated in the earlier webinars. We like to keep it interactive. So if you have questions, and we have Heidelberg, Germany also signing in. Yeah, hi, Laura. We like to keep it interactive, so you're more than welcome to ask questions. As always, we will try to pick them up along as we go in our webinar. So please leave your questions in the chat. We've also prepared some polls to see where you are on certain topics and how you deal with innovation. And then the first poll is actually coming up straight away as sort of a warming up question we have. If you think about how you organize innovation in your organization, and for those of you, by the way, who are working as a consultant, look at your last client or your most favorite client. How well is it organized? Do you leave it up to the forces of nature, which is still the case in many companies? Are you starting to bring some structure to it? Is it relatively well organized, or is it crystal clear? And you can give your answers via the menu Rob has just made available.
Okay. Yeah, so interesting. We left it up to the forces of nature.
At least one person leaves it up to the forces of nature, and well, two of them. Yeah, nobody is of the opinion that it's crystal clear at this point, which is good, because then we still have something to talk about in this webinar. And I think most of you are starting to bring some structure to it, and that's actually what we see at a lot of our companies. I think everybody sort of now understands the importance of innovation as such. But then, as we will explain later on, innovation is often not kind of linked to, well, you need to organize it. And I think that's what's sort of sinking in many environments now, that you really need to organize innovation in order for it to be successful.
Okay, so let's talk about the importance of organizing for innovation. So as Mark said, there's a lot of work to be done within many organizations. I think the poll results also show that that you guys are working on this. But what we see is that sort of most organizations, and especially sort of corporate environments, aren't necessarily conducive to for environments for innovation, right? So their innovation inherently is about change. It's about changing the status quo. It's about finding and exploiting sort of the new opportunities. And in essence, we talk about it's about rocking the boat, right? So and many organizations, they just don't try to rock the boat, right? So they want to keep everything stable and want to execute the known. So there is indeed some resistance to innovation in a lot of organizations. And and the bigger an organization tends to get, the more difficult it becomes to innovate and to let sort of new disruptive ideas in. So organizing for innovation in that sense is an important one, because as Mark said, we see many organizations innovating either by a need to sort of to breach the growth ceiling that they're facing, or maybe there's a disruptor in the market that they need to fend off. And giving innovation a clear place in the organization helps to give it space, but also helps to give it accountability within the organization. So organizing for innovation in essence is a vital step in moving forward. Then obviously a question could be, so why bother with organizing for innovation? And we've done a lot of research through our innovation readiness benchmark study, which we'll talk about a little bit later on during the webinar as well. And if we look at sort of the 5 drivers behind organizing innovation, or the 5 best practices, we see quite a bit of differences between this, let's say what we call the low performers and the high performers in terms of innovation result. And then, firstly, if you look at the low performers, it's only 6% of the low performers rate themselves on high on the best practices and organization of innovation, which obviously is quite low. If you then move on to the average performance, you see that percentage bump up from 6 to 20%. Still a lot of work.
Still not a lot, by the way.
Still not a lot, exactly. But interestingly enough, if you look at the high performers, 53% of the high performers rate themselves high. So, which is actually quite an interesting finding. It's substantial, but there's still room for improvement from that aspect. And I think is also very much in line with the results that we just saw from the poll. And by the way, if you want to take part in the Innovation Readiness Benchmark, it's an open invitation. You can access the Innovation Readiness Benchmark through our website. I think there's a button on the homepage, or you can find it in our section called Growth Warehouse. And if you take the benchmark, you'll be among over 350 companies who've participated to date, and it's free. You'll within let's say 48 hours, you get a report.
Faster, because Rob is always quite fast on this.
Well, just give him a little bit of space, but at least.
Yeah, exactly. And you can rate yourself on 35 best practices, on 5 criteria for innovation performance. And what Rob then will do, we have a nice sort of way of presenting the results. You will get that back, your own results, but also a comparison with all the other companies in the benchmark. And we see that as, many companies kind of use that as a starting point for thinking about where they need to develop. And in some cases, it's really innovation strategy that needs to be dealt with first. But we have a lot of companies say, well, we now have an innovation strategy, but actually we either need to work on the competencies, on our culture, or so it's kind of a starting point in sort of your journey on how to become a best-in-class innovator, as we always say.
Yeah. So go to our website, take the benchmark, and we'll follow up on that.
Exactly. Having said that, finding the thank you. I've lost the button. Sorry for that. I need to activate the screen. As we said in the beginning, there's a bit of a paradox, because in our previous webinars, we already stressed that innovation itself is not a magical, mystical process, but rather a disciplined approach to creating value. And that also relates to how innovation is organized within your organization. Yet there are some paradoxes that you need to take into account. First of all, we quite often see that people think, well, innovation is creative chaos, and you need to sort of maximize the chaos, maximize the creativity, and then maybe even leave it up to the forces of nature, if you like. Yet at the same time, we also see that innovation is a disciplined and organized process, and you kind of need to combine those two. It's not either one or the other. It's actually you need to have both. That also goes for the second point. Innovation is gut feel, entrepreneurship. If you don't have that gut feel, and I'm working with a client in the access control domain, well, their CEO, he is all about gut feel and entrepreneurship. He's all over the place with new ideas, and I think he's the most innovative access control company we currently have. Yet at the same time, you should combine that with rational decision making and also setting priorities. And quite often, one of his ideas, goes through and we make it a success. But quite often we also, well, sorry, we've had a look at the numbers. The gut feel was okay, but you actually need to consider stop doing this. Lastly, another paradox, innovation needs to be bottom up and close to the customer. Which is kind of true, but it also needs to be coordinated. And we'll talk about that central-decentral dilemma later on in our webinar. So what is then organization or organizing innovation all about? Well, first of all, it's about creating a structure that is fit for purpose. And the purpose can differ per company. The situation will differ per company. The means will differ per company, but by explicitly creating a structure for innovation, you kind of signal the importance innovation has within your organization. Secondly, it's about setting up a governance, because structure is one thing, but it's a governance that allows that structure to be effective without, by the way, creating a bureaucracy that kills innovation. That's where kind of often we see that companies, they put in all kinds of mechanisms that they were used to. when governing IT projects, for example. Well, and to some extent, they also are relevant for innovation projects, but you have to sort of, strike the right balance. And I think that has to do with the last point on this page, which is making sure that you have the right competencies and also mindset in place for each role. We won't go into much detail today on that one.
Yeah, we'll talk about it next time.
In our next webinar.
Yeah.
But I always say any structure can work if you have the right people in place.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. There are a couple of principles, general principles we would like to share with you. And those are the kind of, our sort of experiences that you can take into account when setting up your innovation organization. First of all, already mentioned, bureaucracy kills innovation. You need to have some sort of coordination, but please be careful not to make it into a bureaucracy. You always have to kind of foster the spirit of experimentation, celebrate smart failures, and allow your organization to actually do that. We all know innovation is teamwork, and it requires cross-functional cooperation. So please make sure that the teams that you put in place are multidisciplinary, that they can work together, that you cover all the functions within your company. And secondly, the next point actually is you also need to sort of have an outside perspective. You need to tap into the outside world. We'll discuss that later on when we cover the topic of ecosystems. Another key thing, and Matthijs will address that also when discussing the growth board, is that C-level, so the CEO, the COO, or the Chief Innovation Officer, they need to provide what we call the air cover for the innovation function, because it will not always be easy. And lastly, keep in mind that structures are not forever.
Yep.
You need to evolve them as you see fit. And what is good, in 1 year, once the innovation function has developed, might easily not be fit for purpose anymore later on.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the sort of general principles, if you like, that you can take into account.
Yeah. And just a shameless plug, those principles are all described in our book there. So if you want to read up on that, then
Matthijs is one of the authors.
Exactly. I was just briefly looking at the chat. Jonna, thank you for the recommendation for taking the benchmark. No better recommendation than from one of the participants. And yes, we will. We're recording these webinars, so you can rewatch them on our website. Okay, so moving on. So when we started this webinar, Mark already talked about the sort of quintessential question about decentralize or not decentralize your innovation efforts, and in our work, in our practice, working with our clients and innovation, that's always a question: when should we centralize? When should we decentralize? And in our experience, what we see, and especially with organizations that are a bit bigger, which are more and more focused on, let's say, running a tight ship. Those are not typically the environments in which Horizon 2 and 3 type of innovations are at best place, because obviously those organizations and those people are dealing with their day-to-day operations, and obviously they have different incentives in their job to just perform on what they have to do on a day-to-day basis. There are different resources involved, and obviously also a different mindset. So our sort of quick and dirty recommendation is that when disruptive innovation is needed within your organization, when you're looking for that transformation, having a separate innovation function or department is a wise thing to do. But since it's such a sort of a topical thing within our clients, we're so curious whether how you guys look at the topic. And Rob will now launch a new poll, in which we ask you what your preference is. Do you prefer to centralize, or you prefer to decentralize? We're looking at, so I'm all for centralizing innovation. Some central organization is needed. Innovation only thrives when it's decentralized, and then obviously it all depends, which probably applies in all situations, obviously.
Exactly.
But let's see what you guys say. So a lot of you are of the opinion that some central coordination is needed. all for centralizing innovation is a minority, and also the decentralization. So
I think that's also kind of in line with how we see it. We would never fully and only centralize innovation, at least when looking at larger corporates. But leaving it fully decentralized, you can do it, but some central coordination is always needed. And then the question is, of course, how much?
How much exactly? Yeah, and that very much depends, obviously. And then that's answer 4.
It depends
on the type of company you are in, the industry you're in, and also are you
how mature,
what the market dynamics are. So, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So. If we just focus on centralizing the innovation function, I just talked about the difference between Horizon 1 or incremental innovations versus more transformational or disruptive innovations, being the Horizon 2 and 3 ones. There are a number of benefits of centralizing an innovation function. Obviously, it provides focus, right? So I just talked about innovating versus running the business in a day-to-day manner. So having a central innovation function provides focus on the innovation topic, but also to the innovators within your organization. It also enables you to challenge the governing myths and beliefs within your organization. So we're actually giving people the task to look at the organization with an outside perspective and trying to challenge those myths and beliefs. A central innovation function also is a safe place for experimentation, both from the subject matter as well as experimentation with new ways of working. And in that sense, a centralized innovation function can act as a center of excellence for innovation, in which we sort of build up experience with innovation, as well as distribute those learnings to the rest of the organization. And lastly, it's obviously depending on the setup, but a lot of centralized innovation functions, they sort of aren't as hindered by corporate bureaucracy as the standard or the standing organization often is. But with some benefits, there are bound to be some risks as well, which you have to take into account when you're sort of setting up your centralized innovation function. And the first one obviously is that a centralized team can be isolated, right? If it's sort of outside of the organizations or no longer part of the day-to-day activities of an organization, isolation is a risk that you should definitely look into. The other one is if we give the responsibility of innovation to a certain innovation manager or innovation lead, it can also disenfranchise the operational management in that they say, well, it's not my problem anymore. You solve it. You're the innovation leader. So I just
and everybody looks at you to sort of sort it out.
So to deliver. And as you're building your innovation or central innovation team, you're bound to get a different DNA into your organization, which might, if not managed well, might lead to some cultural clashes, which can be functional at times. But when they get dysfunctional, you have to be worried about that. And also with sort of displacing the responsibility for innovation to a central innovation team, you can quickly get into a not invented here type of situation, where people are don't really buy into the innovation because it's not their idea. And as many of these things happen, you have to be wary of that. The central innovation team is drifting too far from the organization, and so there are some telltale signs that your innovation team is too far off from the organization. So you have to be really cautious of that. So in the end, and as with many things in life, it's all about sort of finding the right balance, right? So how do you the right balance between centralizing and decentralizing? And again, as I just said, depends on the industry, the type of organization you are, the resources you have, the innovation strategy, but also your organizational heritage, right? So if you are sort of a fairly young dynamic organization, it's a different situation than your
or when you're a business build up out of a lot of acquisitions,
Exactly.
where each acquisition has its own heritage. and actually works as an independent company, it often makes sense to have a fairly decentralized approach to innovation.
Yeah, exactly. But just to round off this thing, so it's about balance, but it's also about being open to changing your structure over time as the situation dictates.
Which brings us to the what we call the building blocks for your innovation organization. And actually, we identify 5 of them. I will just briefly highlight them, and we will discuss each building block in more detail later on by sort of addressing why should you actually have one, what will be the typical role, and what are kind of the success lessons that we've picked up in working with our many clients. And well, we already addressed the central innovation team, which is kind of an obvious one. You can build a team around innovation professionals. By the way, 61% of the companies in our benchmark indicate they already have a dedicated innovation function. Another key building block is what we call the growth board, or you can say the innovation board, but we prefer the growth board as a label. It's a team of decision makers that actually shape the innovation strategy and also manage the execution of it, and also monitors the portfolio. 41% of the companies in our benchmark already has an innovation board or a growth board. Not that much, by the way, so we would rather seen it a bit higher, because we think this is a great mechanism if implemented correctly to forward or fast forward your innovation efforts. Third one is the innovation network or community, basically all the people working in innovation, which should actually should cover all the functional areas. A whole different topic is, or a different building block is the innovation ecosystem of external partners. And lastly, you can also think about building internal innovation hubs, which is basically your innovation team, and then sort of extended to the next level. Think about incubators, accelerators, hackathons. 26% of the companies in our benchmark indicate they already have an incubation program. By the way, this is a relatively low number, because our benchmark covers not only large corporates, but also smaller scale-ups. And typically, this is something you find in the larger corporates. Well, I said we're going to look more closely at each of these building blocks. And again, feel free to list your questions in the chat, and we will pick them up. Central innovation team. Well, I think we can be a bit brief on this one. Why should you have one? I think Matthijs already covered that. In the end, we think people innovate, not companies, and therefore you need to invest in people, in process and systems. And what you can do by having a central innovation team, you can sort of build that momentum without relying on a lot of expensive tools and processes. They can drive the innovation process within your organization, and they're focused on changing the business rather than running the business. And it's kind of a common practice, in many companies, that they start working with central innovation teams that can either be virtual, so people have it as a sort of a responsibility next to their day-to-day job. That's always quite challenging in our experience, by the way, but we quite often also see dedicated innovation teams. But if you have such an innovation team, and what would be then the typical role? And on the one hand, you can say, well, they need to manage and actually support innovation projects, but we think the role should be broader than that. And first of all, it's about professionalizing innovation within the company, making sure that the decentral teams work according to innovation best practices. Well, not making sure, that sounds like kind of controlling. It's kind of stimulating them, inviting them to. It's also about developing a common language. They can have a key role in scouting innovation opportunities, and also, as a next step, initiate Horizon 2 and 3 projects, which are typically not often initiated by the business units. You can, of course, ask them to manage mission-critical projects, but there's a risk, because then they quickly get occupied with the projects. And another kind of more administrative role is kind of reporting on the innovation funnel to the growth board. It's a kind of a minor task, if you like, but it's actually the best team that is best positioned to keep an overview of the overall innovation portfolio. The amount of time that we'll spend will differ over time. We quite often see that, when they start out, innovation teams, they focus on bringing the basics in place, like an innovation process and portfolio management. and then later on start focusing more on scouting opportunities and developing more disruptive projects. Couple of success lessons. I think they also link to the principles we addressed. Be close to the business and have a good feeling, but while at the same time not being too much part of it. Always try to make sure you bring in the outside perspective, and that's not so much for the innovation team as more for senior management. You should always measure them not on sort of turnover generated, but I think it's more about the ability to explore, to learn, and to translate that back into the organization. Multidisciplinary, I think that's an obvious one. But apart from being multidisciplinary, you also need to make sure your team possesses different mindsets and what we call a healthy mix of DARE, which is exactly the book we talked about. DARE, by the way, Thijs, I think you thought you thought there was one up. So the DARE acronym stands for?
Yeah, so it's defiance. So being able to defy the situation, adventure, realism, and endurance, right? So those are let's say the 4 traits of successful innovators.
Yeah, and you need to have all of those mindsets sort of represented in your team, not
in different people.
Well, because not necessarily every single person has all those 4 attributes, if you like. And lastly, I think I already mentioned that you need to make sure that the team has air cover from senior management, because the going will get tough at a certain point, and then they need the full support. Yeah. Which brings us to the role of the Innovation Growth Board in your organization.
Exactly, and honestly, I think this is one of the most important things to get right within your organization if you want to innovate, effectively. Because the role of the growth board is to sort of fast track the innovation process through your organization, and if you get the right staffing of senior people in your growth board, that should essentially do so, and they should have a mandate, and they should be able to accelerate that innovation process to a level that it at least sort of resembles a startup. I don't think any organization, without being a startup, can actually be a startup, but at least resemble that startup functionality. And the growth board should really help you reduce the risks associated with innovation, and also stimulate and promote, an entrepreneurial mindset within your organization. And the key thing here is that the growth board really sort of visibly, shows leadership when it comes to innovation. Because one of the things that we actually advocate is that if your leadership is not behind innovation, then it's already failed. But you just don't know it yet.
Exactly.
And so that's one of the key things here. What are the typical roles of a growth board? Well, obviously, a growth board sort of being comprised of senior management people and from different departments or backgrounds, is sort of to develop that innovation strategy, but also stick to that innovation strategy. So making sure that it actually happens. They have to promote, obviously, the importance of innovation. So what is the importance of innovation in our growth mix as an organization? Again, as Mark just said, foster that DARE mindset. So make sure that within your growth board, you have enough people with let's say a defiance and adventurous profile, as well as sort of a realism and endurance profile to see innovations through. They have to, as we discussed in our previous webinar as well, monitor that portfolio development through active portfolio management processes and setting priorities between projects. And and a very important role, obviously, is to improve stage gate passing to make sure that projects move from one stage to the next, obviously based on the right arguments. And ideally, they also sponsor key innovation projects and want to provide that importance, but also to provide that air cover to the teams. So then if we look at success lessons for growth boards, obviously you have to, what we say, articulate the innovation agenda. So they really have to embody the innovation agenda within the organization. And so they have to make clear why it innovates and what kind of results it sees.
And that, I think, links also to the question asked by Kim. What type of innovation do we speak of? Is it meant as product services or also internally? I think Evrim already gave the answer, both, I guess. Yeah, I think here it is typically, operational, like minor operational improvements. We wouldn't qualify that as innovation, but I think in the end, anything that creates value for customers should be qualified as innovation. Sure. And if you come up with sort of, fundamental process improvements that lead to either a new customer experience or a fundamental cost advantage, those can easily qualify as innovations.
Yeah.
Yes, Kim, it's not only about products and services that you can sort of feel, touch, or use. Yeah. It can also be about the more internal aspects.
I think what we see is that those topics tend to be intertwined, right? So if you're thinking about your next level business model, which is disruptive or transformative, it also has an impact on the way the organization is structured and operates. So those elements, they're linked together. But just getting back to those success lessons, I talked about the innovation agenda. We talked about diversity of team members, so getting the right people with the right background. So not only financial people or only commercial people or only operational people, just get that diversity in there, both from a functional background as well as from a mindset background. Make sure that you have those as well. They have to, like I said, they need to have that mandate to decide about budgets and resources and really sort of act as an internal VC board, if you will. A good growth board is data driven, so they at least try to set aside their biases and respond to data. And I think, as I just pointed out, is that for an innovation team to function well within that process, a growth board should adhere to a clear decision-making process, right? So an innovation team shouldn't be surprised by the questions, asked by a growth board. They should challenge, obviously inspire and motivate, and lead by example as a key trait. So then let's move on to
and just maybe a last question picked up from Mika. Says, how does the growth board position itself towards a PMO? I think you mean program management office kind of board. Hendrik says, absolutely not the same in my opinion. Different agenda, both have an idea. So I think that's all right. I think, Mika, in answer to your question, I think the growth board is very much focused on as we already advocate, the innovations, where we see a lot of PMO boards who are more focused on sort of the internal transformation programs, which sometimes can sort of include process improvements. But I think that the difference is the external orientation, creating added value for customers, and you will typically see different people in those boards. I think you would typically have your more commercial, marketing-oriented people in your and innovation managers in your growth board, whereas the PMO board often has a transformation manager, a chief operating officer, typically those kind of roles. So I would rather not combine them. Maybe you have some overlap in people, which is only good. Also, with an eye to the time, moving on to the next building block, which is the innovation network. And the main reason for having that is because successful innovators, they've democratized the innovation function and delegated to the people working in the front line. So you have lots of people working on innovation, and actually it has value to bring them together in what we call an innovation network or an innovation community, because they can together then start working on building a common language and sharing best practices and so on. So typical roles, I won't mention all of them, but I think it's first of all about the second one, but that's I think a key one, is supporting innovation on the operating company or the business unit or functional level. Yeah. I think that's really key, that you have people within the organization who kind of feel responsible for innovation, who are sort of, caught by the virus, so to say, and really work on ideation, but also on validating new innovations. It's also about providing access to customers. They can take on the role of innovation coach because, they won't be the only one working on innovations. But if you make sure you have a network of people who is well trained, has the right competencies, who understand the best practices of innovation, I think that's absolutely valuable, because if you have them in your team, they can sort of, contaminate the others, not only with the sort of innovation
I would say
mindset.
Inspire.
Yeah, let's get away from the contamination.
Trying to get out of this pandemic.
Exactly. Yeah, we're having a flu pandemic now, by the way.
That's true.
Yeah. So a couple of success lessons, as I said, build a common language, and language, well, it's not literally, it's about the approach to innovation that everybody applies, that everybody feels comfortable with. We always, would start small and then sort of let the word spread and, start activating other people's, and focus on what we call a coalition of the willing. So you always have the cynics, but if you focus on the people who are truly motivated, once the others see them build successes, they will follow automatically. And I think it's good to keep a community alive by organizing events, share innovation, best practices, and also, update them on where you are with your innovation efforts. So I think a key role for building such a network, we work with companies that have around 400 people working in innovation and R&D projects. So those can be quite massive networks, if you like.
And having an internal ecosystem is important, but also having an external innovation ecosystem is of importance. What we're seeing, and you probably see that in your own environments as well, is that technological development, but also other developments in your business are taking at unprecedented pace, and the complexity is increasing. And we feel that you should not innovate in splendid isolation, right? Don't stay on your own sort of island, if you will, of expertise, and try to make it from that perspective. We feel that having a good external innovation ecosystem in place helps you accelerate innovations and sort of develop more fundamental innovations, as well as de-risk your innovation portfolio as you're getting external expertise in. And what we see with the clients we work with, for example, we work for one of the larger airlines here in the Netherlands at the moment, is they set up an external innovation ecosystem with people who have specific technological expertise, for example, around IoT, around artificial intelligence, and even robotics. So those are areas which you don't necessarily have within your organization, but you want to use for your next level of innovations. So if you look at the makeup of an innovation ecosystem, they're bound to be different partners. It could be universities or even research institutes like TNO in the Netherlands or Rathenau in Germany. Sort of look at more fundamental research and try to translate that into more practical applications. You can look at startup programs, for example, like Startup Bootcamp or Rockstart or Y Combinator, or all of those different programs that you can sort of take into your external innovation ecosystem. But also strategic technology suppliers. And an interesting one, if you're trying to fix let's say an industry issue from an open innovation perspective, you can also invite your actually competitors into your ecosystem. So as I said, an external ecosystem can help you develop, disruptive innovations. It adds innovation capacity and know-how and technology. And sometimes it helps you develop standards, right? In some industries, that's really important, just to get the industry rallied around an innovation.
I'm working on one case now in particular, which is about introducing a new mobile credential technology, where it really helps if everybody sort of adopts one single standard instead of developing it by four different people.
Yeah, and I think lastly, the role of an external innovation ecosystem is also to provide inspiration to the organization for innovation. Well, obviously, when you start working with external partners, there are some success lessons that we can share. I think one of the most obvious ones, but also a very important one, is that you align on vision and ambition. So why do we have this external innovation ecosystem? And what are the joint goals, and what are they getting out of it? So really focusing also on those win-win situations. And oftentimes you can get into sort of conflicting or competing commitments, and those are some things you have to look at in advance and make sure that you proactively manage them.
I think those are probably the two key ones out of this list, and also addressing them proactively, because that's where it often goes astray.
It's almost like pre-mediation in many of these.
Exactly, it's almost like a marriage, Matthijs, isn't it?
It is,
which brings us to the last building block, which is what we call internal innovation hubs. And as said in the beginning, if you even want to create more focus, you can consider building one. You can think of innovation labs, incubators, accelerators, what have you. It kind of depends on the size of the company, the resources that you have available, what's best suited for you. Obviously, not everybody can sort of afford a full-blown incubator. As the name already says, a corporate incubator is mainly for larger corporates. However, it's a viable option if you really need to build innovation momentum and if you want to protect your innovation, if innovation efforts against suffocating corporate bureaucracy. Typical roles, it's the acceleration by taking them out of the day-to-day business. I think that's maybe the key one. It's nurturing disruptive ideas, and I think that's where incubators differ from accelerators. The incubator is really about helping ideas to develop into a dedicated business with a solid business model, whereas accelerators are really about expediting the scale up.
Yeah.
It creates focus, and by creating such an environment, you can also have the build a true innovation mindset and approach. So those are a couple of, I think, potential advantages if you play it right. But as said, it's probably the most centralized way of innovation. So not necessarily recommended for every company.
Very much depends, as you said, on the size of the company and the situation you're in.
Exactly. And well, I think absolutely key here is that you establish a clear purpose and also a well-defined scope, because before you know it, you'll have scope creep and they start, becoming so unfocused that in the end, the value is not created. Be aware that it's quite an expensive option, so you need to secure your funding and be willing to spend it. And I think the second last one is really make sure that you define upfront how the innovations that come out of those incubators and accelerators are actually adopted by the regular organization for scale up.
Absolutely.
And that's also preventing the risk Matthijs addressed earlier on from isolation and innovation.
Not invented here.
Not invented here syndrome. Which I think, having said that, we've now covered those 5 building blocks. Just a quick poll. Which building block is best developed in your organization, if any? But at least pick one, I would say.
I'm curious, is it the central innovation team, the growth board, the network ecosystem, external ecosystem, or hubs? And if there's one which you are sort of particularly proud of, maybe you can share it within the chat so that everybody can see it. Okay, so central innovation teams, external ecosystems.
The network. It's actually good to see that the external innovation ecosystem is rating quite high here, which, to be honest, it kind of surprises me just a little bit. But it's actually encouraging because I think a lot of value can be created by tapping into such an external ecosystem. Good to see, and hopefully the insights we just shared, and we'll now start focusing more on the growth board just briefly, will help you to develop the other building blocks that you haven't mentioned as well. We have, by the way, we will make available a download of the presentation, but we also have a one-page summary. Rob will make it available, which summarizes all the roles and the success lessons of the 5 building blocks on one page. So please download that if you're interested. And just the last topic for today is a bit more detail on the growth board.
I think some of you in the chat you offer some of your experiences with the growth board. We also just saw in the poll that the growth boards, I think it was 4 answers out of the 36. So it's sort of the least development function within the organization. But as I said at the beginning, I think it's one of the key functions in an organization to make sure that that innovation actually takes off within your business. So we just wanted to leave you as a sort of a wrap up as some let's say some wise words on growth boards and how to develop them. And as I said, the growth boards really are meant to sort of fast track the innovation process, and that has an important role in the stage gating as making stage gate decisions within your organization. And that is really key here, that a growth board keeps an innovation process clean, right? So it says, I think we said in the portfolio management webinar that managing innovation is saying no to 1,000 things, and that really is the role of the growth board, to make sure that your funnel stays clean, that what you go through comes through, and what doesn't come through actually is taken off the table with the right purpose in mind. And one of the typical pitfalls that we see is that sort of a growth board starts to take on the role of the management team of the entire organization, and as such starts to sort of form an opinion about all projects, so both incremental as well as disruptive projects.
It's kind of a black hole for all your innovation projects that are sucked into that.
Yeah, exactly, and that is bound to lead what we call corporate congestion, right? So everything has to go through that one funnel and nothing moves, and we've seen that with quite a few of our clients where innovation portfolios they just don't move because everything is stuck in that one funnel. And the other risk obviously is that it takes away sort of a corporate ownership and responsibility from the organization. So it's basically what we say is that the growth board should really focus on projects from a strategic perspective, and they have to really apply a filter of will those sort of deliver our strategic objectives, yes or no? So that on the one hand, and again, they need to be focused on more the transformational or disruptive projects.
By the way, Armela asks a question: who is in the growth board?
Yeah.
What are typical roles that we see there?
Yeah, so it's obviously people with mandates, so people who can make decisions. So they tend to be C-level people. A growth board makeup is again what we say, it has to be fit for purpose. So you need the right competences and also functional backgrounds within your growth board as it pertains to your portfolio, right? So. If there are too many people in your growth board who have actually no experience or no mandate or no say about the project within your portfolio, you have to make sure that they're sort of out of that. So you typically see the main corporate functions represented within the growth board.
And and a mix of the kind of the real C-level people, but also business unit or division management level.
Yeah, exactly. So typical topics that I think that the growth board should be looking into is they should be focused on creating progress. They should be challenging, but should not be opinionated. They should be seeking for hard evidence over opinions. And also make sure that innovation stays within the guardrails of the process, right? So that everything is that the team stick to that process as we agreed upon it. And again, in line with Armela's question, make sure that we have enough functional expertise within in the growth board represented.
Because in the end, it's all about the people.
It's all about the people, indeed.
Exactly. Yeah. And in this webinar, we discussed what you could call the hard factors of organizing innovation, and some would even qualify this as a rather blue approach. Due to the focus on structure, roles, responsibilities, and you know what? That's actually true. It's kind of the bluer seminar or webinar, if you like. But as we argued in the beginning, this is typically the innovation paradox of organizing creativity on the one hand and disruption on the other. Organizing creativity and disruption on the one hand, and making sure it's well organized, focused on the other hand. Yeah. And they seem to be opposites, but in actual fact, they are both flip sides of the same innovation coin. And as you probably already will know, any structural process is doomed to fail if you leave it to people that do not have the right mindset and who do not have the right competencies. And the other way around is also true. If you have the right people, they will make almost any structure work.
Yeah.
So when you organize innovation, keep that in mind, that in the end, it's all about the people. And that's exactly what we will be talking about in our next webinar on innovation skills and competencies and innovation mindset. We will make the link available in about a minute. Before we do so, please note, this is kind of the commercial break at the end, that we have some helpful resources on our website. You can get our book on there. You can participate in the benchmark, as we already said. We have the Corporate Innovation Playbook available there. Lots of tools and templates available in the Growth Warehouse. You can always reach out to us.
Absolutely.
Or to Rob, for that matter, and have a one-on-one conversation with us.
Yep.
So many options to explore. Do join our next webinar. I think, Rob, you already made it available. It's on screen already. It's on the 21st of April, one day before my birthday. So luckily not on my birthday.
So there are treats in the next one.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Well.
So I just want to check.
Don't get overexcited.
Yeah. Are there any questions that we missed that we should answer? I thought, Annelies, I think there
was one from Jonne in the beginning. If you can talk about the ideal team size.
Yeah, that's difficult. We'll talk about.
It depends.
It depends exactly, but we'll talk about it next month when we talk about roles, responsibilities, competences, and the makeup of innovation teams. So, but as sort of a primer to that question, it's very difficult to say that to talk about size, because it depends on the topic, obviously.
And it depends on your innovation ambition. It depends on the size of your organization. But again, more on that later on in our next webinar. We're now at the end of the webinar. It's 1 minute to 11. I think we should give everybody
wrap up
1 minute break before moving on to probably the next Teams meeting or live meeting. Luckily, again. We hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks from our side, and hoping to see you back again on the 21st, as Rob already mentioned in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. Have a good day, and keep innovating.
Okay. Bye-bye.